The sensor array at Outpost Vel 9 was old. Not broken, just old. It had been scanning the edge of the hollow reach for 60 years without finding anything worth reporting. So when it flagged a gravitational anomaly in the dead zone past Sector 44, the two technicians on duty assumed it was a calibration error and ran a diagnostic first before telling anyone. The diagnostic came back clean. The anomaly was real. It was massive. The Drevan Empire had one of the most complete warship registries in the known galaxy. Every vessel above a certain tonnage from every species that had ever signed a trade compact or a surrender document was logged and cataloged. The registry had entries for ships the Empire had destroyed centuries ago, just for completeness. When the outpost fed the gravitational data into the registry and asked for a match, the system returned nothing. Not an unknown nothing. The mass reading was larger than any warship class the Empire had ever recorded. Fleet Commander Dalen Rohr received the report 3 hours later. He read it twice, set it down, and read it again. He was not a man who panicked, and he did not panic now. What he felt was something closer to professional curiosity, the same careful interest he might give an unexploded ordnance on a battlefield. He requested a scout wing and got one without argument. High Command was not worried, but they were willing to let him look. He took 4 ships into the Hollow Reach. The Hollow Reach was unclaimed space, which in Empire terms meant space the Empire had not yet decided it wanted. It was not empty. Asteroid fields stretched across it in loose, drifting bands, thick enough to scatter sensor signals and thin enough to navigate. The Empire had surveyed it twice in the last century and found nothing of interest either time. Rohr had flown through it before on training runs and remembered it the way most officers did. Quiet, dull, and very, very dark. It was quiet now, too. That was the first thing that bothered him. There was no anomaly where the registry said there should be one. His sensors picked up the asteroid fields, the usual trace radiation from the nearby star cluster, the faint background noise of deep space, nothing else. The 4 ships spread into a search pattern and swept the area for 6 hours. They found debris, drifting metal fragments, some scorched, some not. Rohr had his team scan the fragments and found they were not ship wreckage. They were containers. Small, sealed, and built from an alloy that did not appear in the Imperial Materials database. His science officer opened one. Inside was a sensor node, compact and sophisticated, with a small antenna dish still extended and transmitting. Rohr looked at it through the display feed and said nothing for a moment. "It's watching us," his science officer said. "Has been since we arrived," Rohr answered. He pulled his ships back into a tight formation and did a full active sweep, pushing his sensors to maximum range. He found 17 more of the containers distributed across the field, some tucked against asteroids, some floating freely, all transmitting. Whatever had placed them had arranged them to cover every approach angle. Anyone entering this region of the Hollow Reach would be seen from multiple directions simultaneously. Someone had built a surveillance network out here, in unclaimed space, with technology the Empire did not recognize. Rohr filed his report honestly and completely. He listed everything, including his own assessment that the sensor nodes were not the work of pirates or rogue traders, that the engineering quality was too high and the placement too deliberate, and that whatever had placed them almost certainly knew his wing was there right now. High Command read the report and told him he was probably dealing with a well-funded smuggling operation. They thanked him for the thorough work and told him to withdraw. The Hollow Reach was not a priority sector. There were no Imperial assets at risk and no reason to escalate. Rohr ordered the withdrawal and brought his ships back to formation, heading for the border. The escort ship on his rear flank, a small fast-response vessel called the Vel 9, went silent 40 minutes into the withdrawal. No distress call, no combat alert, no explosion registered on any sensor. The ship simply stopped transmitting mid-routine status update, the way a voice stops when someone puts a hand over a mouth. Rohr turned his remaining ships around immediately. They searched for 2 hours. They found nothing. Not wreckage, not a debris field, not a single hull fragment or trace of engine output. The Vel 9 had been there, and then it had not been there, and the space where it had been was completely, perfectly empty. He filed a second report. This one he marked urgent. High Command did not tell him he was overreacting. This time they read it in full, passed it up the chain, and began drafting orders for a larger response. Somewhere in those early discussions, a historian attached to the War Council pulled an old file. He read it, set it aside, and then went back and read it again more carefully. He did not say anything about it yet. He wanted to be sure before he alarmed anyone. Out in the hollow reach, the sensor nodes kept transmitting. Whatever was receiving the signal was patient. It had been patient for a very long time already. 3 cruisers and a screen of 8 escort vessels crossed into the hollow reach under orders to find the missing ship, identify the source of the sensor network, and eliminate any hostile presence. The task force commander was Sub-Admiral Brent Oss, a methodical officer known more for precision than imagination. He did not expect to find much. He expected to sweep the sector, locate a wreck or an abandoned station, write a clean report, and return home within the week. The Dreadnought appeared on his long-range sensors 4 hours into the search. Oss's display team spent 11 minutes confirming the reading before anyone said a word out loud. The object was real, solid, and enormous. It sat at the far edge of scanner range, inert, radiating almost no heat and almost no engine output for something of its size. It had no running lights. It made no broadcast on any standard frequency. It simply existed, massive and dark, the way a stone exists at the bottom of a deep lake. His communications officer tried every standard hailing protocol. Nothing came back. They tried the common trade frequencies, the emergency bands, and 2 diplomatic channels reserved for first contact situations that had never actually been used in Oss's career. Still nothing. The object did not respond, did not maneuver, did not acknowledge their presence in any way. Oss followed standing doctrine. An unidentified vessel that fails to respond within the protocol window is classified hostile. He gave the order to advance and engage. His 3 cruisers moved forward in a tight wedge. The escorts spread wide to cover flanks. They closed the distance over 40 minutes, and as they got closer, the readings got stranger. The vessel's hull was angular and flat-sided in a way no Imperial ship was ever designed. Imperial warships were built with curves and swept lines to reduce stress fractures in combat maneuvers. This thing looked like it had been built by engineers who had simply decided the physics of aesthetics did not matter, who had put armor where armor needed to go and left everything else as bare geometry. It was ugly in the way tools are ugly, completely and unapologetically functional. The lead cruiser opened fire at combat range. The weapons hit. The sensors confirmed impact against the hull. The hull did not breach. For 30 seconds, nothing else happened. Then the Dreadnought released its drones. They came out of recessed bays along the hull's underside, hundreds of them, each one roughly the size of a large shuttle. They did not move like missiles. They moved like insects, spreading wide and fast, circling around Oss's formation from multiple angles before any targeting solution could lock onto them. The escorts opened fire and hit a dozen of them, which slowed the swarm not at all. The drones did not fire weapons. They attached. Each drone latched onto the hull of a ship and began broadcasting a precise, targeted frequency into the ship's power systems. Oss's engineering crew on the lead cruiser reported it first. The shields were dropping, not from damage but from drain. The power was simply being drawn out through the hull, fed into whatever the drone was doing. They could not interrupt it, because the drone's signal was adapting faster than the engineers could adjust their countermeasures, matching every frequency change they made before they finished making it. Within 8 minutes the lead cruiser was dark, engines dead, weapons offline, life support running on backup reserves. The second cruiser suffered the same fate 12 minutes later. Oss ordered the third cruiser to break formation and run. It took 3 drones on the hull before it cleared the swarm's range, and each one drained a portion of its systems before falling away as the ship accelerated past the drone's pursuit threshold. The ship escaped, barely, with its engines at half power and its weapons fully dead. Aboard the disabled cruisers, the crew waited in the dark for what came next. What came next was boarding parties. They arrived in small pressurized craft that cut through airlocks with tools that had never been cataloged in any imperial reference. The beings who entered were tall, bipedal, and wore full sealed suits that gave nothing away about their appearance except their approximate size, and the calm way they moved through a ship full of frightened Dreven crew members. They did not speak in any language the translators could parse. They moved through the ship like they had studied its layout in advance, going directly to the engineering sections, the weapons controls, the communications arrays. They touched nothing that was not directly relevant to the ship's combat capability. They left the crew untouched. One of them stopped in a corridor near the bridge. A young Dreven officer was pressed against the wall, watching. The suited figure looked at him for a moment, then reached into a pouch and set something on the floor before walking away. The officer waited until it was gone, then picked it up. It was a small data chip. When the third cruiser's escape crew eventually recovered it and ran it through a reader, it contained a single document. The document was in old Dreven script, formal and precise, and it said only, "We know you are coming. We have been waiting. Send someone who can make decisions." The third cruiser filed its report. The War Council read it in full session for the first time in 30 years. The historian, who had been sitting quietly in the back of the room, finally raised his hand and asked to speak. He had found the old file. He knew what this was. The archive room in the War Council building was underground, which was appropriate, because what it contained had been buried as thoroughly as anything could be buried without being destroyed. The historian's name was Arvin Sewell. He was 71 years old, had spent 40 of those years in records, and had never once in that time been asked to address a full session of the War Council. He stood at the front of the room and felt their eyes on him, and chose his words the way a man chooses his footing on ice. He told them that 312 years ago, the Dreven Empire had fought a war. The council members shifted. They knew this. It was in the public record, briefly and without much detail, a border conflict with a young species, resolved in the Empire's favor inside of a decade. A footnote in the Imperial history curriculum, a paragraph. Sewell told them the paragraph was not accurate. The truth, which he had spent the last 2 days confirming across multiple sealed archive layers, was that the war had been significantly harder than any public record admitted. The humans, as the species was called, had not been the disorganized primitive force the official account described. They had been outnumbered and outgunned, yes, and their core colonies had fallen. But they had fought in a way the Empire's war planners had not anticipated, using tactics built on disruption and cost imposition rather than direct engagement, targeting supply lines and communication relays instead of fleet assets, making every Imperial advance expensive enough that winning felt like losing. The Empire had won. That part was true. The human core worlds had surrendered, and the war had ended on Imperial terms. But a portion of the human fleet had not surrendered. Somewhere between 1/5 and 1/3 of their total warship tonnage, along with several mobile shipyard platforms and an estimated 12 to 15 million civilians aboard colony transports, had simply left. They had not fought their way out. They had slipped away in the chaos of the final campaigns, using the same disruption tactics against the Empire's own sensor networks to mask their departure. The Empire had assumed they were destroyed in the fighting or scattered beyond recovery. The Empire had not looked very hard, Sewell admitted. The war was won. Looking for survivors seemed unnecessary. The council was quiet. Sewell put the gravitational reading from Outpost Vel 9 on the display and placed it next to the projected mass of the largest human warship class on record from the Old War. The Dreadnought in the Hollow Reach was, by its mass estimate, approximately 7 times larger. 300 years, he said. They had 300 years to build. The council session that followed lasted 9 hours. The debate was less about what to do and more about how to discuss what to do without acknowledging how badly the situation had already been misread. Grand Admiral Soren Vale, who commanded the Empire's second expansion fleet, was the loudest voice for immediate action. He pointed out that the humans had attacked Imperial vessels, disabled 2 cruisers, and issued what amounted to a diplomatic ultimatum on a data chip rather than through proper channels. He called it an insult layered on top of an ambush. He was given authorization to take his fleet into the Hollow Reach and end the matter. Vale had 41 warships. He was not worried. The Dreadnought was 1 ship, however large, and 1 ship could be surrounded. Aboard that ship, somewhere deep in the Hollow Reach, a crew of humans had been watching the council building's communications traffic for 3 days. Not because they had broken Imperial encryption, though they had, but because the Empire's communication satellites in this region were operating on hardware that was, by human standards, very old. Captain Halden Reyes sat in the operations center of the Dreadnought and listened to his signals team read out Vale's fleet composition as the 41 ships began forming up at the border. 41, his navigation officer said. That's more than we projected. Reyes looked at the fleet map on the main display. 41 ships arranged in standard Imperial battle doctrine, a formation the Empire had used for 200 years and taught in every military academy in their space. He had studied Imperial battle doctrine for most of his adult life. Every officer in the human fleet had, because when you are preparing for the day a much larger empire decides to finish what it started, you learn everything about the way that empire fights. He asked his signals officer whether the relay network in the Reach was fully active. Fully active, she confirmed, coverage to the outer marker and back. He asked whether the passive stations along the Empire's likely approach vectors were transmitting clean data. Clean and undetected, she said. He looked at the fleet map for another moment. Then he asked his crew to begin the final preparation phase for what they had spent the last 4 years setting up, and what the humans had spent the last century planning for, which was not a battle in any sense the Empire would recognize when it arrived. It was a lesson. The 41 ships moved into the Hollow Reach. They were loud on sensors, which was intentional. They wanted the Dreadnought to see them and feel outnumbered. They had no way to know that every ship in that formation was already being watched from 17 different angles by systems they had never detected and would not detect until it was far too late. The Hollow Reach swallowed them all. The first ship that vanished was the scout frigate running point on the fleet's leading edge. It was a routine forward sweep, the kind run 1,000 times on 1,000 patrols, and the frigate's crew had no reason to treat it differently. They were checking a dense asteroid cluster for hidden vessels before the main fleet passed through the gap. Their last transmission was a standard all clear. Then the channel went quiet. Then a minute passed. Then 5. Grand Admiral Vale ordered 2 ships to investigate. They found the cluster empty. No wreckage, no distress beacon, no sign the frigate had ever been there. One of the investigation ships ran a full active sensor sweep at maximum power, burning through its stealth profile in exchange for the deepest possible scan. It found nothing. Vale pulled his fleet closer together and continued advancing. The second disappearance happened 8 hours later. A destroyer on the left flank broke formation briefly to adjust its heading around a large drifting rock. The adjustment took 4 minutes. When it came back around, the ship beside it in formation was gone. Again, no wreckage, no signal. The space where the ship had been was empty, the way a room is empty, after someone has carefully removed everything from it. The fleet stopped advancing. Vale ordered a full communication check across all 40 remaining ships. 39 responded immediately. The 40th took 90 seconds longer, and when it answered, its crew reported that they had briefly lost contact with Fleet Command but were present and operational. Vale's communications officer ran a diagnostic on the channel and found a trace anomaly that she logged but could not identify. This was the first sign, though no one recognized it yet, that the humans were not simply taking ships. They were studying the fleet's communication architecture, testing response times, mapping which frequencies were used for what purpose, and doing it so gently that the Imperial systems registered it as noise rather than intrusion. Vale split his fleet into 3 groups and swept the surrounding space in overlapping patterns, trying to find whatever was taking his ships. The groups found nothing. What the sweep did accomplish, without Vale knowing it, was to separate his 40 ships into 3 clusters of unequal size, which was exactly the formation geometry that the human relay network had flagged as optimal for the next phase. 2 more ships vanished in the night cycle, when crew alertness was statistically lowest according to the human intelligence reports on Dreven crew scheduling. Vale woke to the reports and felt, for the first time since entering the Hollow Reach, something he had not felt in 30 years of command. He felt uncertain. He sent a boarding party to recover one of the cruisers disabled in the earlier engagement, hopping to find intelligence on what he was dealing with. The party arrived to find the cruiser completely intact. Every system was operational except weapons and main engines, both disabled with the same precision as before. The corridors were empty. The crew quarters were empty. Personal items were still on bunks. Food was still in the galley. One terminal in the communications room was still running, displaying a paused tactical simulation of some kind that the boarding party photographed and transmitted back to Vale before anyone thought to look at it closely. When Vale's tactical staff analyzed the simulation, they went quiet for a very long time. It was an Imperial Fleet exercise scenario. Specifically, it was a classified exercise run by the Imperial War College 11 years ago to train officers in encirclement tactics. It should not have existed outside secure Imperial systems. The humans had not just obtained it. They had modified it, annotated it in their own language with what the translators eventually rendered as notes on Imperial response patterns and correction opportunities. They had been studying the Empire the way a student studies an exam. Vale called a command meeting. His senior officers sat around the display table and looked at the updated fleet map. 37 ships remained confirmed present. 3 were gone without explanation. The Dreadnought had not been sighted since the initial detection. Every sensor sweep of the surrounding space returned normal readings, which the officers now understood meant nothing at all because they had no idea what normal readings in human-controlled space actually looked like. One of Vale's captains suggested they withdraw. She pointed out that they were losing ships at a rate that suggested systematic targeting rather than random attack, that they had no effective counter to the disappearances, and that continuing to advance toward an enemy they could not locate, in space the enemy clearly knew better than they did, was not a sound tactical position. Vale overruled her. Retreating from a single ship, however large, was not something he was prepared to explain to high command. He ordered the fleet to hold position and concentrate firepower, turning his formation into a dense defensive globe, every ship facing outward, overlapping sensor coverage in every direction. It was a textbook response to an unknown threat in open space, taught in the second year of tactical studies. The humans had the same textbook. They had annotated that section too. By the time Vale realized his defensive globe had done nothing except make it easier to calculate which ships were on the outer layer and which were protected inside, he had lost 4 more. The outer layer was simply being peeled away, one ship at a time, with a patience that felt less like combat and more like someone slowly and methodically sorting a pile of objects into the ones they wanted and the ones they did not. He was not the hunter. He had not been the hunter since he entered the Reach. He understood that now. He did not yet understand how completely the trap had closed. What Vale saw on his main display was not something his training had prepared him to process. It was the Hollow Reach, a region of space he had entered 2 days ago as unclaimed and empty, and it was neither of those things anymore. The asteroids were moving. Not randomly, not under natural drift, but in slow and deliberate arcs that were repositioning them into a pattern his tactical officers were still trying to classify. Several of the larger rocks had cracked open, and from inside them came structures that had clearly been built there deliberately. Antenna arrays, weapon platforms, relay stations all folded neatly into artificial cavities and sealed with a surface coating that matched the surrounding rocks so precisely that the Empire's sensors had read them as solid stone for 2 days. The Hollow Reach had not been surveyed. It had been developed, and the development had been hidden inside the landscape itself. Vale counted 19 weapon platforms before his staff stopped updating the count, and simply said there are more and we cannot track them all. The Dreadnought appeared then, not from the direction any of his ships were facing, but from directly below relative to the fleet's orientation, rising from behind an asteroid cluster that had been parked 600 kilometers off and which had, until approximately 4 minutes ago, been broadcasting a clean empty space sensor signature. It was running no lights as before. It moved slowly. It did not fire. Around it, visible now on every scanner, were the other ships. They had been there the whole time, silent and cold running in the dark between rocks, shaped and coded to disappear inside the ambient sensor noise of the asteroid field. Vale counted 31 of them before his communications officer interrupted him to report that the fleet's jump drives were offline. Not damaged. Offline. The same targeted frequency drain that had disabled the cruisers in the earlier engagement was now being applied simultaneously to every ship in the formation, broadcast from the weapon platforms at a power level that overwhelmed any local countermeasures. The fleet was parked. No jump, engines at fractional thrust, weapons operational but pointed at targets that were dispersed, armored and dug into positions designed to absorb Imperial fire while returning fire from angles the Imperial ships could not all cover at once. Vale's captain, the one who had suggested withdrawal days ago, said nothing. She did not need to. The communication request came through on an open channel, which was unusual, and in clear Dreven language, which was more unusual, and in the formal diplomatic register used between sovereign governments, which stopped the entire bridge of Vale's flagship from moving for a full 3 seconds. The voice was calm, not arrogant, not cold, simply calm the way a person is calm when they have already done every difficult thing and are now only required to speak. The voice introduced itself as Captain Halden Reyes of the human vessel Reckoning, and it said that no one intended to harm Vale's crews. It said that the ships which had vanished were intact and their crews were safe, held aboard human vessels, and would be returned when the current situation was resolved. It said the weapon platforms would not fire unless fired upon, and it invited Vale to take as much time as he needed to assess his position before responding. Vale assessed his position. It took less time than Reyes had offered. He asked what the humans wanted. Reyes answered without hesitation. Humans wanted recognition, he said. Not territory, not reparations, not an apology, though an apology would not have been unwelcome. What they wanted was for the Dreven Empire to update its understanding of the galaxy. Specifically, to update its record of humanity from pacified remnant to sovereign state, with the full legal standing and border recognition that entailed. They wanted a treaty written between equals, not a clemency arrangement offered by a superior power to an inferior one. Vale said that the Empire did not negotiate under threat. Reyes agreed that this was the Empire's stated policy. He then pointed out that the Empire had twice attempted to address this situation with force, and had twice failed to achieve the intended result, and that a third attempt with more ships would produce a third failure for reasons he was prepared to explain in as much technical detail as Vale wished. He said this without mockery. He said it the way an engineer explains a structural flaw in a building, not to embarrass the building's owner, simply because the flaw exists and pretending otherwise does not make the building safer. There was a long silence on the channel. Then Vale asked to see the crews of the missing ships. Reyes arranged a visual confirmation within 15 minutes. The Dreven crews were in good condition, in clean facilities being fed. One of them, a young officer who recognized the camera, waved at it awkwardly and held up a small sign that read "We are fine" in Dreven script. It looked like someone on the human side had helped him write it. Vale sat with that image for a moment. He had 41 ships when he entered the Hollow Reach. He had 33 now, all of them immobilized. He was surrounded by an infrastructure that had taken decades to build and had been invisible to the Empire's entire intelligence apparatus until the humans chose to reveal it. He had been outplanned, outpositioned, and outweighted by a species his civilization had written off as a footnote. He asked his communications officer to open a formal channel. He told Reyes he was prepared to discuss terms. Reyes said that was all they had ever asked for. The treaty took 11 days to draft. It was written aboard the Reckoning, which was the first time in 300 years that a Dreven Grand Admiral had sat at a table inside an enemy vessel under anything other than a prisoner arrangement. Vale had expected the human ship to feel primitive inside, a rough and improvised thing built by survivors working from old memories. Instead, the interior was clean and purposeful, all function and no waste, the same design philosophy as the hull. The corridors were wide enough for 2 people to pass comfortably. The lighting was warm. The air recyclers ran quieter than anything Vale had on his own flagship. He noticed the first day that the walls in the meeting room carried no decorations. No flags, no insignia, no portraits of leaders or maps of victories. Just a single line of text in the human language printed plainly above the door. He asked the translator to render it. The translator worked for a moment and then gave him, "Patience is the longest weapon." Vale did not comment on it. He wrote it down. The treaty was transmitted to Imperial High Command on the 4th day. The reaction was not uniform. A faction of the Council wanted to reject it and mobilize a larger force. This faction spent 2 days making that argument before someone pointed out that if the humans had built a concealed infrastructure network of that scale in the Hollow Reach, there was no reason to assume the Hollow Reach was the only place they had built one, and that mobilizing a larger force without knowing where those other networks were located was not a military strategy so much as a plan to lose more ships in more locations. The argument for rejection went quiet after that. The treaty was ratified on day 11. The Empire recognized human space as sovereign territory. It defined borders along coordinates the humans provided, which turned out to encompass a region roughly a quarter the size of the Empire itself, a fact that produced a very long silence in the council chamber when the cartographers put it on the display. The humans had not just been hiding. They had been settling, quietly and extensively. In space, the Empire had never bothered to fully survey because it had seemed empty. It had not been empty. It had been waiting to be found. Dalen Rohr received a copy of the final star charts 3 weeks after the treaty was signed. He had been on administrative leave since filing his second report, which High Command had initially marked as an overreaction before circumstances made overreaction look like understatement. He was not blamed for what followed, exactly, but he was not thanked either. An administrative leave was the Empire's way of keeping someone available to blame if the political situation shifted. He spent the leave reading, mostly, and waiting. He spread the new charts across his desk and looked at them for a long time. The territory marked as human space was detailed in a way the old Imperial surveys never were. Every star, every planet, Every station and outpost and settlement was logged with precise coordinates. The humans had shared the complete picture, which meant they were not afraid of the Empire knowing where they lived, which meant they were confident the Empire understood what attacking those locations would cost. Roar traced the border with one finger. It ran along the edge of the hollow reach and then extended deep in 3 directions, curving around systems the Empire had catalogued as uninhabited, passing through regions his own charts marked as unsurveyed or uninteresting. At one point, the human border came within 4 light-years of an Imperial refueling station that had been operational for 80 years. For 80 years, there had been a human settlement 4 light-years away, and the Empire had not known. He folded the charts and sat quietly. Across the wider galaxy, the reaction to the treaty rippled outward in the way that significant events do when word travels through trading posts and diplomatic channels, and the careful conversations of species who are always watching to see which way power is moving. The Dreven Empire was not diminished on paper. It had signed a treaty, not a surrender. But everyone who understood how that treaty had come about drew the same conclusion, which was that the Empire had sent a fleet into an ambush it had not detected, lost ships without being able to fight back, and been walked through a negotiation by a species it had spent 3 centuries assuming did not matter. Several minor powers, which had been quietly waiting to see how certain unresolved border disputes with the Empire might eventually resolve, began requesting updated diplomatic meetings. Their tone in those requests was subtly but unmistakably different from the year before. On the human side, there was no celebration in the public record. No parade, no ceremony, no official announcement of victory. Captain Reyes gave a single address to the Human Strategic Council, brief and factual, confirming that the treaty was signed, the missing Dreven crews had been returned, and all human personnel had been accounted for. He said this was a beginning, not an end, and that building something durable would be harder than building something that could not be ignored. Then the reckoning returned to its patrol route. Somewhere beyond the new border, in systems that did not yet appear on any chart the Empire possessed, construction continued. New shipyards, new stations, new vessels taking shape in the dark. Not because war was coming, because the humans had learned at great cost and over a very long time that the galaxy's memory was short, and that the best answer to a short memory was something large and patient and quiet, waiting to be rediscovered whenever someone made the mistake of forgetting.